It was a quiet afternoon in a small town, the kind of day where the sunlight poured gently through the windows of the diner, making everything look warm and calm. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the clinking of cutlery, and the faint smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. People were scattered around the diner, some alone, some in pairs, quietly talking or scrolling through their phones. Outside, a gentle breeze made the trees sway slightly, adding a peaceful rhythm to the world. At one of the tables near the window, a large black man sat alone, enjoying a late lunch. He was not someone people would notice immediately in a crowd. He wore a plain shirt stretched slightly over his broad frame and a pair of worn jeans. His hair was short and his face carried a calm, relaxed expression. He seemed ordinary in every way, the kind of man who could sit in a place like this without anyone giving him a second thought. He had ordered a burger and fries, and a cup of coffee, black, no sugar. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, not rushing, not worried about anything. Every so often he would look out the window, watching people pass by on the sidewalk. There was a gentle kindness in the way he smiled at the waitress when she came to check on him. He greeted her warmly, chatting for a few moments about the weather and the new decorations in the diner. She smiled back, grateful for his friendly attitude. It was clear he had been here before, familiar with the routine of the place, the people, the atmosphere. Meanwhile, a group of men entered the diner from the other side. They were loud and brash, carrying the kind of energy that made people shift in their seats nervously. Their laughter was sharp, almost aggressive, and their eyes roamed around the room as if searching for someone or something to provoke. They were not subtle, and it did not take long for their presence to be felt. The man at the window noticed them immediately, but he did not react. He continued to eat, taking slow, deliberate bites. His calmness was striking, almost unusual given the tension in the room. He had learned long ago that staying calm could diffuse situations before they got out of hand. It was a lesson life had taught him many times, though most people would never guess it from his quiet demeanor. The group of men started talking among themselves, and their voices grew louder, their tone turning mocking. They looked at him directly, smirking, making jokes under their breath. One of them leaned back against a table and laughed, pointing in his direction. Another whispered something, and the whole group chuckled. The words were cruel, aimed to provoke. They made slurs, mocking his size, mocking the way he carried himself, trying to make him feel small, unworthy. Most people in the diner felt uncomfortable. Some looked down at their food, pretending not to notice. Others exchanged worried glances, but no one moved. They had that hesitation, that pause when they were unsure whether to intervene. It was the kind of moment where fear and uncertainty hung in the air like a heavy fog. The man continued to eat, seemingly unaffected. He did not shout, he did not argue, he did not even look angry, but inside he was aware of every movement, every tone of voice, every glance aimed at him. He had faced dangerous situations before in life, situations where a single mistake could have had serious consequences. He knew how to assess a threat, how to remain calm under pressure, and how to react when necessary. But for now, he chose silence. The gang's confidence grew as they saw his calmness. In their mind, silence was weakness. One of them took a step closer and knocked lightly on the edge of his table. The man looked up slowly and their eyes met. There was a moment of quiet intensity. The man's gaze was steady, unflinching, filled with a calm authority that was impossible to fake. For a brief second, the group hesitated, feeling a strange unease, but it was quickly replaced with arrogance. They were sure they could intimidate him. One of them leaned over, speaking louder this time, trying to provoke a reaction. "Hey, big guy," he said, smirking. "You gonna say something, or are you just gonna sit there like a statue?" The others laughed, thinking they had found their prey. They were wrong. The man did not rise to the bait. He took a slow sip of his coffee, placing the cup gently back on the table, his movements precise and controlled. He spoke softly, his voice calm but firm. "I'd appreciate it if you left me alone," he said. Nothing more, just a simple statement. The gang laughed at this, mocking the idea that he could make them stop. One of them reached out and lightly pushed his shoulder, a test, a small challenge. The man did not react immediately. Instead, he shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his position, his body language changing subtly. Muscles tensed just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. His hands rested on the table, ready, controlled. There was a quiet strength in him, a presence that could not be ignored. Other diners began to sense that something was different. The air in the room felt charged, a mixture of tension and anticipation. The group of men were confident, but the small signals they were missing were the ones that mattered. The man did not move aggressively, but there was a controlled power in him that made the space around him feel different. It was not anger or fear. It was awareness and readiness. The gang's leader, noticing the subtle shift, exchanged a look with his friends. There was a flicker of doubt, a small recognition that maybe, just maybe, they had misjudged him. But arrogance won over caution, and they laughed it off, convinced they could still provoke him. They thought size and numbers were enough to intimidate anyone. The man finished his meal, each bite deliberate, unhurried. He kept his eyes on the group, not threatening, but observing, analyzing every detail. He noted how they moved, how tense their bodies were when they laughed too loud, how their attention kept returning to him. He knew instinctively that their overconfidence could be their downfall if things escalated. The waitress, sensing the tension, approached with a nervous smile.
"Can I get you anything else?"
she asked softly. He shook his head and smiled back gently. "No, thank you. I'm fine," he said. His calm tone reassured her, though she still looked worried as she glanced at the men nearby. The group of men continued to make noise, drawing attention from other patrons, some of whom whispered to each other, clearly worried. But the man remained composed, a steady presence in the middle of the chaos. He knew that reacting too early could make the situation worse, and he also knew that patience was a weapon. He had learned this the hard way in life, through experience that taught him to control not just his body, but his mind and emotions as well. As the minutes passed, the gang grew increasingly frustrated by his lack of reaction. They started speaking louder, their jokes becoming meaner, more insulting. One of them even reached over to knock his coffee again, as if to provoke him into losing control. The man's hand moved slightly, repositioning the cup carefully, but his expression remained calm, his voice steady. He did not lash out. He did not give them the satisfaction of fear or anger. The other diners, now fully aware that something serious might happen, watched silently. Some gripped their phones, ready to call for help if needed. Others whispered among themselves, anxious about what might come next. It was a tense moment, the kind that could break in any direction. But for now it held like a taut wire, vibrating with the potential for conflict. The man at the table reflected quietly, not on the insults, not on the gang, but on the principle that had guided him through life. Strength is not measured by anger or reaction, but by patience and control. He had been trained to deal with dangerous situations, to assess threats, and to act decisively when necessary. But he also knew that a calm presence could sometimes prevent violence before it even started. The gang, in contrast, relied on noise, intimidation, and aggression. They did not understand that their behavior was being observed, measured, and analyzed by someone who had faced real danger before. They were confident that their numbers and loudness gave them power, but they underestimated the quiet authority that sat across from them, waiting for the right moment. And so, the afternoon in the diner stretched on, with the man finishing his meal calmly, the gang growing more restless and impatient, and the other patrons holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Outside, the sunlight continued to pour through the windows, a gentle reminder that life could be both peaceful and dangerous, often at the same time. The calm before the storm was thick in the air, and though no one could see it yet, the next moments would reveal that appearances could be deceiving. That strength and courage often came in quiet, unexpected forms, and that one man's patience and skill could turn a dangerous situation around before it ever became unmanageable. The tension in the diner continued to grow. The gang was no longer just talking. Their actions became bolder, more provocative. One of the men leaned across the table where the large man sat, trying to make him flinch or respond. The gesture was deliberate, meant to intimidate, and the others laughed loudly, thinking it was amusing. The man did not react. His eyes followed the movements calmly, like a quiet storm waiting to break, observing every twitch, every glance, every smirk. Other customers were watching now, some with fear, some with curiosity. A mother clutched her child's hand and pulled slightly closer. A young man at the counter paused mid-bite, unsure whether to intervene or keep to himself. Even the waitress, who had tried to remain calm earlier, now hovered nearby, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped a table. There was an unspoken hope in the room that the situation wouldn't escalate, that nothing dangerous would happen. The gang, however, did not share that hope. They were fueled by ignorance and arrogance. One of them knocked over a sugar container on purpose, spilling sugar across the table where the man was sitting. He looked down at the mess, then back at the group, his expression unchanged. "I said, leave me alone," he said softly, calm and steady. His words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were firm. There was a subtle authority in his voice that made the gang pause for just a moment. They laughed it off, thinking it was a bluff. One of them grabbed a chair and slid it noisily across the floor, intentionally bumping into him. The large man shifted slightly but did not react violently. He stood slowly, just enough to regain control of his space, his movements deliberate, careful, and precise. Everyone in the diner noticed the change. There was something in the way he moved, a quiet confidence that seemed to command respect even without a word. The gang took that as a challenge. One of them stepped closer, trying to force a confrontation. He thought he could provoke fear or anger, something that would justify them acting violently. He didn't understand that the man in front of him was not ordinary. Years of experience, discipline, and training had taught him how to handle dangerous situations with precision. He did not need to raise his voice or throw a punch to be in control. Instead, the man's presence alone created a barrier. His posture was firm, his gaze unwavering. His breathing was steady, controlled and deliberate, showing neither panic nor aggression. To anyone paying close attention, it was clear he was aware of every potential threat in the room, and he had already calculated how to respond if necessary. This was not intimidation for show. It was careful preparation, the kind of readiness that came from experience in situations far more dangerous than this. The gang began to get frustrated. Their initial amusement was fading, replaced by impatience and confusion. They expected him to react like an ordinary person might, with fear, anger, or panic, but he remained calm. That calmness felt unnatural to them, and it unsettled them more than any loud confrontation could. They were losing control, and their arrogance had not prepared them for this. One member, clearly more aggressive than the rest, tried to corner him. He pushed lightly against the man's arm while sneering, thinking it would provoke a reaction. The large man shifted slightly, not aggressively, but with an adjustment that changed the angle between him and the aggressor. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to someone not trained in reading body language, but it was enough to establish control. The aggressor felt it immediately, though he could not explain why. Something about the man's calmness, his readiness, made the air between them tense and uncomfortable. Other patrons began to notice the shift too. The subtle tension in the room became tangible. The chatter of the diner quieted, the background noise fading as everyone instinctively recognized that something serious was happening. There was a sense that this was not going to end with insults and laughter. The large man's control over the situation was growing, and even without a word, it was clear to anyone paying attention that he was not someone to underestimate. The gang tried to maintain dominance through volume. They shouted slurs, made cruel jokes, and continued to mock him, hoping that verbal attacks could provoke an emotional response. The man remained unaffected. He continued to watch, to calculate, and to respond with only the minimal words necessary to set boundaries. "I don't want trouble," he said quietly. "Please leave me alone." His voice was calm, yet firm enough that anyone could hear it carried authority. The group, growing impatient and reckless, tried one more tactic. They began moving around the table, blocking his path as if to intimidate him physically. One of them grabbed a chair and swung it lightly, just enough to make him flinch, or so they thought. But the man did not flinch. He adjusted his stance, grounded himself, and shifted his weight just slightly. It was not aggressive, but it was a clear message. He was ready, aware, and in control. At that moment, a sense of shock began to spread through the gang. Their bravado was slipping. The easy target they had imagined was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a calm, deliberate presence, someone who seemed to weigh every action and calculate every response. It was not fear that they saw, but a readiness that they could not match. They began to realize too late that they had misjudged him. Despite their growing doubt, the gang persisted. One of them, acting as if nothing had changed, tried to grab a napkin from the table and knock over his coffee again. The large man's hand moved smoothly, catching the cup before it spilled, placing it back on the table without a word. The gesture was small, almost casual, but it spoke volumes. It was a demonstration of control, patience, and composure under provocation. Other diners were now fully aware that the situation could escalate. Some pulled out their phones, ready to call for help if necessary. Some whispered to each other, concerned for the man and unsure how the situation would unfold. The waitress hovered nearby, tension visible on her face, silently praying that nothing would escalate to violence. The large man, sensing the tension in the room, continued to maintain his calm. He knew that overreacting could worsen the situation. He also knew that patience was a powerful tool. By remaining calm, he gave the gang no leverage, no satisfaction, no justification for escalation. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and controlled. Every word he spoke was minimal but carried authority. The gang's frustration became visible. One of them slammed a fist on the table, startling some of the other patrons. "Why won't you just get mad?" he shouted.
Why don't you react like a normal person?
The man looked at him steadily, his gaze unwavering, and said nothing. There was no fear, no anger, only quiet awareness. That silence was louder than any words they could shout. One by one, the other gang members noticed the difference. They began to hesitate, exchanging confused looks. The situation was no longer under their control. Their confidence, once so strong, was cracking under the weight of his calm authority. They could feel it, even if they could not articulate it. There was a sense that whatever happened next would not go the way they expected. The large man finished the last bite of his meal slowly, deliberately. He did not rush. His hands were steady, his posture firm, and his eyes never left the gang. He was aware of every movement, every potential threat, and every possibility in the room. His mind was sharp, calculating, yet not with anger or revenge, but with the clear goal of maintaining control and preventing harm. The gang, sensing that something was about to happen, made one last attempt to provoke him. They moved closer, laughing, shouting, and mocking. But the man did not respond with aggression. Instead, he shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his stance, his presence commanding attention and respect. There was no hesitation, no fear, only readiness. Other patrons who had been silent witnesses began to realize the danger the gang had invited upon themselves. They watched closely, some holding their breath as the large man demonstrated restraint, skill, and calm under pressure. It was a lesson in patience, discipline, and quiet strength. The gang's leader, noticing the subtle but unmistakable control the man had over the situation, frowned. He realized deep down that they had misjudged him. The easy target they had expected was not there. Instead, there was a man who could handle this situation far better than they could ever imagine. For the first time, doubt crept into their minds, and the arrogance that had fueled them began to crumble. The man did not celebrate their hesitation. He remained calm, continuing to observe, ready to act if necessary, but not giving them any further reason to escalate. Every gesture, every movement, and every word was measured, designed to maintain control while avoiding unnecessary conflict. By the end of the afternoon, it was clear to everyone in the diner that the situation had reached a turning point. The gang, though still loud and aggressive, was no longer fully confident. The man, calm and composed, had established a presence that could not be ignored. The atmosphere in the diner shifted from tension to quiet anticipation, as if everyone understood that the next moments could decide the outcome of a dangerous encounter. And through it all, the large man remained a quiet pillar of patience, demonstrating that true strength was not in volume or aggression, but in self-control, awareness, and the ability to face danger without losing composure. The tension in the diner had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. The gang had grown more reckless, fueled by frustration and anger. They were no longer just talking. Their movements became sharper, more deliberate, designed to intimidate. Chairs scraped across the floor as one of them shifted closer to the large man. Leaning aggressively over the table, another slammed his fist against the counter, making the sound echo through the diner. Patrons froze, unsure whether to move, call for help, or simply wait for the confrontation to resolve itself. The large man remained calm, almost unnervingly so. His eyes scanned the room carefully, observing every movement, noting every potential threat. He did not flinch, did not speak harshly, and did not show any anger. Yet there was an unmistakable tension in his posture, a quiet power that could be felt even by those who did not know him. He shifted slightly in his seat, grounding himself, adjusting his weight in a way that would allow him to move with speed and precision if necessary. Every small movement was deliberate, controlled, and calculated. The gang did not understand what they were dealing with. They assumed that their size, numbers, and loudness would intimidate him into submission. They did not realize that the calmness he displayed was not weakness, it was control, the kind that came from years of discipline and experience in dangerous situations. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality that they were overestimating their power and underestimating his skills. One of the men, clearly the most aggressive, decided to escalate the situation. He grabbed a chair and raised it slightly as if intending to swing it or push the large man with it. The movement was slow enough for the man to see it coming. Without panic, he shifted his body weight, stepping slightly to the side, ensuring he was balanced and ready. His hands were relaxed but prepared, his eyes fixed steadily on the aggressor. He was not looking for a fight, but he was ready for one if it came. The gang laughed, thinking he would flinch or react violently, which they believed would give them control of the situation. But nothing happened. The large man remained still, calm, his presence commanding attention. The laughter of the gang began to falter slightly as they noticed his lack of fear and the precise way he positioned himself. There was a subtle warning in his calmness, a message that he was fully aware of what was happening and fully capable of handling it. Another member of the gang tried to corner him, moving so that the large man had less space to maneuver. The large man did not panic. He adjusted his stance, maintaining a balanced position that would allow him to move in any direction quickly. Every muscle in his body was ready, every instinct alert. He did not need to act aggressively to show that he was in control. His posture, his steady gaze, and his calm demeanor were enough to convey that any action from the gang could backfire. The other patrons were now watching closely. Some whispered to each other, trying to understand what was happening. A young couple at the back table clutched their drinks tightly, unsure if they should intervene. The waitress, who had been hovering nearby, kept her hands on the counter, her eyes darting between the man and the gang. She could feel the tension building and knew that a single wrong move could change everything. The large man remained composed. He continued to observe the movements of the gang, reading their body language, predicting what they might do next. His mind was calm but active, analyzing each individual's behavior, noticing the subtle signs of hesitation that were beginning to show in the gang. The confidence that had fueled their actions was starting to crack. They were beginning to realize that the quiet man sitting at the table was not someone to underestimate. Despite this, one of the gang members decided to push harder. He reached across the table and tried to knock over the man's coffee cup, hoping to provoke an angry reaction. The large man's hand moved smoothly, catching the cup before it spilled and gently set it back on the table. The motion was simple and controlled, yet it carried a message. He was fully aware of what was happening and would not be provoked. At that moment, a hush fell over the diner. The other patrons could sense the subtle but powerful shift in energy. What had started as loud and obnoxious behavior from the gang was beginning to feel dangerous, and everyone in the room could sense it. The calmness of the large man contrasted sharply with the chaos around him, and it was becoming clear that he was not someone to challenge lightly. The gang's frustration grew. They had never encountered anyone like him before. Their confidence, which had been bolstered by their numbers and loudness, was slipping. They began arguing among themselves, unsure how to handle a situation where their usual tactics were failing. One of them slammed a fist on the table, shaking the cups and plates, but the man did not react. He simply adjusted his position slightly, keeping himself balanced and ready. It was then that one of the gang members tried a new tactic. He moved closer, attempting to invade the man's personal space, thinking that intimidation would force a reaction. The large man leaned back just enough to maintain distance, his eyes steady on the aggressor. He did not flinch or show fear, but his presence filled the space around him, making it clear that any further action from the gang could result in immediate consequences. Other diners could see the subtle control he had over the situation. His calmness was not passive. It was active. He was fully aware of the threat, fully prepared to act if necessary, and yet he chose restraint. That restraint was what made him more powerful than the gang members could understand. They relied on aggression, noise, and intimidation, while he relied on discipline, awareness, and calculated readiness. The gang's leader, noticing the growing hesitation in his friends, tried to regain control by shouting louder, using words meant to provoke and dominate. "What's the matter? Why don't you get angry?" he yelled, hoping to trigger a reaction. The large man looked at him steadily, not with anger but with a firm calmness. "I don't want trouble," he said. "I am asking you to leave me alone." His words were quiet but carried an undeniable authority. The gang members faltered. The clear and composed response combined with his calm presence made them pause. They had expected anger, fear, or panic, but what they got instead was complete control. It was a form of power they could not understand or counteract. Their previous confidence wavered, replaced by doubt and unease. The large man's patience was becoming the dominant force in the room. He continued to observe, calculating, anticipating, and preparing for any action. His calm demeanor kept the situation from spiraling out of control, even as the gang's frustration grew. The other diners, sensing this subtle control, began to feel a mixture of relief and awe. It was clear that if the situation escalated, he would handle it with precision and effectiveness. Suddenly, one of the gang members lunged slightly, trying to push the man out of the chair. The large man reacted immediately, but not with anger. He shifted his weight, guiding the movement off balance, and used his size and strength to subtly control the situation. The aggressor stumbled slightly, more from surprise than injury, and the other gang members froze, realizing they had underestimated him. A quiet authority now filled the diner. The large man's presence alone created a boundary that the gang could not cross without consequence. His movements were minimal but effective, precise but controlled. It was a silent warning. He was ready for anything, and any aggression would be met with an equally measured but unstoppable response. The tension in the diner was palpable. The other patrons watched, some holding their breath as the situation continued to unfold. The gang's confidence had been shattered, replaced by confusion and fear. They had walked in thinking this would be easy, that their numbers and loudness would guarantee dominance. But they were facing someone who had faced real danger, someone whose calm authority outweighed their aggression. The large man adjusted his posture, ensuring he could move in any direction quickly if needed. His mind was clear, analyzing, observing, and preparing. He was not looking for conflict, but he was ready to act decisively if necessary. Every subtle movement, every small shift in position communicated control without aggression. The gang, now visibly shaken, tried one last tactic. They shouted, tried to crowd him, and continued to mock him, hoping to provoke fear or anger. But he remained calm, steady, and prepared. The room was quiet except for the clattering of the gang's movements, the faint murmur of the other diners, and the steady breathing of the man at the table. It became increasingly clear to everyone that the large man was not only calm, but also fully aware and fully in control. His restraint, his presence, and his quiet authority created a boundary the gang could not cross. The tension had reached its peak, and the next moments would determine whether the situation would escalate further or collapse under the weight of his composed strength. By the end of the afternoon, the gang was exhausted from their failed attempts to intimidate him. Their arrogance had been replaced by confusion and fear. The man remained seated, calm, and prepared, a quiet force that had completely changed the energy in the diner. The other patrons, once anxious and unsure, now watched with a mix of awe and relief, realizing that the man's patience, awareness, and calm authority had kept a dangerous situation from spiraling out of control. The calm in the diner returned slowly, but it was different now. There was a respect, unspoken but palpable, for the man who had maintained control without aggression. He had turned what could have been a chaotic scene into a lesson in patience, discipline, and quiet strength. The diner had grown eerily quiet. The laughter and shouting of the gang had faded into tense murmurs, and all eyes were on the large man at the table. He had remained calm through all their provocation, observing their every movement and adjusting his stance with precision. Now the moment of reckoning had arrived. The gang had pushed too far, and it was clear that the man could no longer remain passive without risking harm to himself or others. The largest of the gang members, the one who had been the loudest and most aggressive, leaned in close, trying once again to assert dominance. His eyes darted nervously as he realized the man did not flinch. He expected fear or anger, a momentary weakness he could exploit, but there was nothing. The calm in the man's eyes was unlike anything he had seen. It was a quiet authority, the kind that made people stop and think twice about their actions. The large man stood slowly, deliberately, making sure his movements were smooth and controlled. There was no rush, no panic, only readiness. He positioned himself between the gang members and the door, ensuring that anyone attempting to leave or act aggressively would immediately encounter his presence. Patrons watched, holding their breath, sensing that a critical moment was about to unfold. The gang, fueled by frustration, lunged forward. Chairs were swung, a fist was raised, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. But the large man moved with precision. He sidestepped the first swing, guiding the arm to the side, and used his weight to off-balance the aggressor just enough to prevent harm. Every move was controlled, calculated, and deliberate. There was no excessive force, no unnecessary aggression. He was not looking for a fight. He was looking to neutralize the threat. The other gang members froze, shocked at the ease with which their comrade was redirected. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by confusion and fear. They had thought themselves unstoppable, but the man's calm authority had shifted the balance entirely. Every subtle adjustment in his posture communicated readiness, strength, and experience. It was clear he had dealt with danger before and knew exactly how to handle it. A member of the gang tried to circle behind him, hoping to catch him off guard. The man's senses were sharp, his instincts honed by years of discipline and training. He noticed the movement immediately, pivoting just enough to block the path without a single aggressive motion. The gang member stumbled slightly, startled by the unexpected resistance, and the rest of the group began to panic. Patrons began to murmur quietly among themselves. Some reached for their phones, ready to call the authorities if necessary, but they hesitated, unsure if intervention was needed. They watched in awe as the large man maintained control without escalating the violence. His calmness was not passive. It was active and commanding. Each movement, each glance, each adjustment in his stance sent a silent message. Any further aggression would be met with immediate and effective response. One of the gang members, clearly the most reckless, decided to try a direct attack. He swung a chair toward the man, aiming to hit him in the side. The large man shifted instantly, catching the chair's leg with one hand and guiding it harmlessly to the floor. The motion was fluid, almost graceful, but it carried undeniable strength. The diner seemed to hold its breath as the chair clattered harmlessly away. The gang members hesitated now, realizing they were no longer in control. The man's calm presence and precise movements had dismantled their confidence. They were confused, unsure of what to do next, and it was this confusion that gave him the advantage. He moved with careful, deliberate steps, ensuring that anyone trying to attack would be stopped before harm could occur. The largest of the gang stepped forward again, trying to regain control. His voice was loud, harsh, and desperate. "Back off. Don't think you're some kind of hero," he shouted. The large man's response was quiet but firm. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will defend myself if I have to. Leave now and no one gets hurt." His tone was calm, yet it carried the weight of certainty. The message was clear. He had no intention of escalating unnecessarily, but he would not allow aggression to continue. The gang, shaken and disoriented, began to retreat slowly. They exchanged uncertain glances, their arrogance replaced with fear. The man did not pursue them. Instead, he maintained his stance, keeping a careful watch on their movements as they backed toward the door. His body was tense but controlled, ready to respond to any sudden motion. He had made the situation clear. Any further provocation would be met with immediate, decisive action. Other diners breathed a collective sigh of relief. The tension in the room began to ease, though the air still carried the weight of what had almost happened. The waitress stepped forward cautiously, placing her hand on the large man's shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "I'm fine. It's over now," he said quietly. His calmness reassured her, though she could still sense the lingering tension. The gang members fled the diner, their bravado completely shattered. They had walked in thinking they would intimidate someone, but they had been met with discipline, control, and quiet authority. The contrast between their reckless aggression and the man's calm precision was stark, and it left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. Once the immediate danger had passed, the large man returned to his seat. He adjusted his chair, sat down slowly, and took a deep breath. There was no celebration, no rush of triumph. He simply returned to his meal, finishing what he had started earlier. His calmness had prevented chaos and injury, and now he could finally relax. The other diners, still shaken, began to process what had happened. They whispered to each other, recounting the details, expressing awe at how a single man had handled a situation that could have turned violent. The lesson was clear. Appearances could be deceiving, and true strength was not measured by loudness or aggression, but by patience, skill, and control. The waitress brought over fresh coffee, setting it gently in front of him. "On the house," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. He smiled briefly and nodded, appreciative of her gesture. It was a simple acknowledgement, a quiet moment amidst the chaos that had unfolded just moments before. Word of the incident began to spread quickly. Patrons who had witnessed the scene shared their stories with friends and neighbors. By the end of the day, nearly everyone in town knew about the calm, disciplined man who had faced down a gang without losing control. The large man did not seek attention or recognition. He simply returned to his life, quietly observing, quietly guiding, and quietly protecting when necessary. The incident also became a topic of discussion in the diner. People talked about how easily a situation could escalate and how important it was to remain calm and observant. The large man's actions provided a powerful example of restraint and discipline. It was a lesson not only in self-defense but also in human behavior, patience, and courage under pressure. For the gang, the lesson was harsher. Their arrogance had been replaced by fear and confusion. They had underestimated someone who appeared ordinary, and the consequences of that misjudgment were immediate and undeniable. The realization that appearances could be deceiving left a mark on them, one they would not forget. The large man remained humble, aware that his actions could have had different outcomes if he had not stayed composed. He reflected on the importance of self-control, the need to remain aware, and the value of preparation. His experience had taught him that true strength was not in aggression, but in the ability to handle dangerous situations calmly and effectively. By the end of the afternoon, the diner had returned to its usual rhythm. The other patrons resumed their meals, conversations slowly returned, and the sounds of a normal afternoon filled the room once more. Yet there was a lingering sense of respect for the man who had remained calm in the face of danger, a man whose presence alone had prevented chaos and potential harm. In the quiet that followed, the large man finished his coffee and slowly gathered his belongings. He nodded to the waitress, offered a small smile to the patrons who had watched him, and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. Outside, the world continued as usual. But for those who had witnessed the events in the diner, there was a renewed understanding of courage, discipline, and the quiet power of a calm mind. The incident left a lasting impression on the community. People spoke of it not as a story of violence, but as a story of restraint, awareness, and skill. The large man had faced a dangerous situation and had handled it with precision and care, demonstrating that true strength was measured not by force alone, but by the ability to control oneself, assess danger, and act decisively when necessary. In the days that followed, the diner returned to normal, but the story of what had happened spread. The patrons who had witnessed it carried the lesson with them, remembering the calm, steady presence of a man who had turned a potential disaster into a moment of quiet authority. The large man continued his life quietly, knowing that he had done what was necessary, and that the lesson of the day would linger long after he had left the diner. The calm authority he displayed became a silent reminder to the community. Courage was not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes the most powerful actions were those carried out with patience, skill, and restraint. The large man's actions had prevented harm, taught a lesson, and left a lasting impression on everyone who had been present. The diner had settled back into its usual rhythm, but the air was different now. The quiet buzz of conversation felt lighter, less tense, yet the memory of what had happened lingered. Patrons who had witnessed the confrontation were still exchanging glances and whispers, processing the events they had just seen. The large man who had faced the gang remained calm, seated at his table, finishing his coffee with slow, deliberate movements. Even though the danger had passed, the man was aware of the subtle tension that still hung in the air. He took a moment to observe the diners around him. Some were still nervous, holding their hands over their cups or glancing repeatedly toward the door. Others had begun to speak in low voices, discussing the bravery they had just witnessed. There was a sense of admiration, a quiet respect that didn't need words but was palpable in the room. The waitress approached again, cautiously this time with a small smile. "I don't know how you did that," she said softly, almost in disbelief. The man smiled back quietly without arrogance. "I stayed calm," he said simply. "That's all." His words were understated, but they carried a lesson. He had not sought recognition or praise. He had acted because it was the right thing to do, because restraint and awareness had allowed him to handle the situation without escalating it further. Outside, the sunlight was beginning to fade, casting a warm, golden glow through the windows of the diner. It highlighted the ordinary setting in which something extraordinary had taken place. A quiet hero had emerged, not through force alone, but through discipline, calm, and the careful use of skill and experience. The gang, meanwhile, had fled the diner and scattered down the street. Their laughter and bravado had disappeared, replaced by confusion and fear. They had walked in believing they could dominate someone with intimidation and aggression, only to discover that appearances could be deceiving. The realization that they had misjudged the man they had tried to provoke left a mark on them, one that would linger for a long time. Inside the diner, the patrons began to return to their routines, but the atmosphere was subtly changed. Conversations were quieter, more reflective. People shared their impressions of the man who had stayed calm under pressure. They spoke of his patience, his awareness, and the quiet authority that had allowed him to handle a dangerous situation without unnecessary violence. Children who had been present were told stories by their parents about courage, not as something loud or aggressive, but as something measured and controlled. The large man eventually stood, gathering his belongings slowly. He nodded to the waitress, acknowledging her concern and support. The other patrons watched as he moved toward the door, his presence calm but commanding. There was a sense that even in leaving, he had left a mark on everyone in the room. The lesson of restraint and quiet strength lingered long after he stepped outside. As he walked down the street, the large man reflected on the events of the day. He thought about how quickly situations could escalate, how dangerous assumptions and arrogance could be. He also reflected on his own actions, knowing that remaining calm, observing carefully, and acting decisively had prevented what could have been a far more serious situation. His experience and training had allowed him to remain in control. But he knew that courage was not just about skill, it was about awareness, patience, and the ability to remain composed when others sought to provoke you. In the following days, the story of the incident spread through the town. Patrons of the diner shared the account with friends, family, and co-workers. The tale was not about violence, but about how one person's calm authority and skill could prevent chaos and harm. People discussed the lessons learned, how assumptions based on appearance could be dangerously wrong, and how patience, self-control, and awareness could be powerful tools in everyday life. The large man continued his daily life quietly, going about his routines, helping the community in small, unnoticed ways. He did not seek recognition or praise. To him, the events at the diner were not about heroism. They were about doing what was necessary, staying calm, and preventing harm. He remained humble, understanding that his actions had been effective because he had maintained self-control and awareness, not because of aggression or desire for attention. Over time, the community began to reflect more deeply on the lessons from that day. Local leaders spoke about the importance of calmness in the face of conflict, and schools used the story to teach children about courage, awareness, and patience. Parents told their children that bravery did not always mean fighting loudly. Sometimes it meant staying calm, thinking carefully, and using skill and judgment to handle a difficult situation. For the man himself, the experience reinforced his values. He knew that life often presented challenges that could not be met with force alone. Awareness, preparation, patience, and restraint were just as important as strength or skill. The incident at the diner had tested all of these qualities, and he had succeeded because he relied on them. He also reflected on human behavior. He understood that the gang had acted out of ignorance, arrogance, and a need to dominate. He did not hold personal anger toward them. Rather, he recognized that their actions were a reflection of their misunderstanding and fear. By remaining calm, he had provided an example not only of strength but also of restraint, showing that control and awareness could prevent unnecessary harm even in the face of aggression. The diner staff and patrons continued to speak of him with admiration, though he himself avoided attention. He returned to the diner occasionally, quietly sitting at a table enjoying his meals without fanfare. Those who had witnessed the incident felt a sense of comfort knowing he was present. His calm presence had transformed the diner from a place of fear to a place of safety and respect. Over time, the gang faced consequences for their actions. Legal authorities intervened, and they were held accountable for the intimidation and aggression they had displayed. The town's residents felt a renewed sense of justice, knowing that recklessness and arrogance could not go unchallenged. The story of the large man's calm response became part of the town's narrative, a lesson in courage, awareness, and the power of restraint. The man himself continued to live quietly, helping others in ways that often went unnoticed. He offered guidance, support, and a steady presence to those around him. His example showed that true strength was not loud or aggressive but measured, controlled, and rooted in the ability to face challenges without fear or unnecessary anger. In the evenings, as he walked through the town or sat quietly at home, he reflected on the incident. He thought about the importance of being prepared, of understanding human behavior, and of using skill and awareness to prevent harm. He knew that situations like the one at the diner could arise anywhere, at any time, and that the ability to remain calm and composed was a powerful tool in everyday life. For the town, the memory of the incident remained vivid. People remembered the quiet authority, the controlled movements, and the calm presence that had turned a potentially dangerous confrontation into a lesson in restraint and skill. Children learned about courage in a new way. Adults discussed the importance of awareness and patience, and the community as a whole gained a deeper understanding of what true strength could look like. The large man never sought recognition, but his actions had a lasting impact. His calm, measured response had prevented harm, taught a lesson, and left a mark on everyone who had witnessed it. The story was not one of violence or aggression, but of control, patience, and quiet power. It showed that bravery could take many forms, and that the ability to remain composed in the face of danger was one of the most important forms of strength. As time passed, the diner continued to operate as usual, but the atmosphere was subtly changed. Patrons remembered the day with a sense of respect and reflection. The large man's presence, though quiet, had transformed their understanding of courage and authority. He had shown that appearances could be deceiving, and that true strength was often measured by patience, awareness, and the ability to act decisively without unnecessary aggression. The man continued to live his life quietly, maintaining the discipline, awareness, and calm that had served him so well. He helped those around him, guided by experience and a sense of responsibility. His story became a quiet legend in the town, not because he sought fame, but because his actions had spoken louder than words ever could. In the end, the incident at the diner was remembered as a moment of calm triumph over arrogance and aggression. It was a story that taught important lessons about patience, awareness, discipline, and the power of quiet strength. The large man had faced a dangerous situation and had handled it with skill, precision, and restraint. The community learned that courage was not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it was calm, measured, and rooted in the ability to remain composed under pressure. The lessons from that day continued to ripple through the town. Children, adults, and elders alike spoke of the importance of awareness, patience, and self-control. They remembered the large man not as a figure of fear or intimidation, but as an example of how calm authority and measured action could prevent harm, restore order, and teach lasting lessons about courage and human behavior. Even years later, those who had been present in the diner would recall the calm, steady presence of the man who had faced the gang. They would remember how he had handled a dangerous situation without losing his composure, how he had turned aggression into a lesson in patience and strength, and how his actions had changed the way they understood courage.